So this is the second part of the imperialism lecture. It won't probably take very long. We're going to go over a few case studies. This is part 5 of the lecture, and then sort of just wrap it up. So nice and easy for you guys today. I do, and I stress this so very much, that when I give you these lectures, they are based upon the information that is in your book, and the link to the book can be found in the syllabus on Blackboard. Please be reading those chapters. They are not very long. They will help you out. So let's talk about a few case studies for imperialism here. One of the big ones is the British Empire in India. And so the East Indian Company was established well before the period that we are concerned with. But it's a prime example of a European nation exploiting a country's resources and their population. So not only will it be the cultivation of tea in India, but also the cultivation of poppy plants. So once the demand for tea kind of went down, and I know it sounds weird to us here in the United States, but like British people love their tea. And to this day, they still love their tea. But they had cultivated so much tea out of that region that the price of it was just going down, 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 down. So in the mid 1800s, in order to sort of make their presence in India profitable, Britain became the world's largest drug dealer by basically taking the poppy plants that grow in India and turning them into opium. They would then take this opium and illegally import it to China, where they would sell it to the Chinese people. Now, the Chinese people were exploited, and typically, not always, but typically, people that are happy and healthy and have a decent life don't turn to a life of drugs or abuse. But the people in China were not that way. They were not living happy and healthy lives. And so when the opium showed up, they smoked it because it sort of just made you feel nothing. And this became such a big issue that the Chinese government, there will actually be 2 wars called the Opium Wars, where China will face England, and England will win both of them and continue to import opium for, till the early 1900s. And this just goes to show you that these imperialist countries were willing to do whatever to exploit these other countries that were out there. Another example is the scramble for Africa. And in 1884, European countries get together, and we're talking about Belgium, England, France, Germany. I think that's it. I know that Italy was not included. That's one of their motivations in World War II, is to get involved in Africa. But at the Berlin Conference in 1884, these countries get together and they decide they're going to split up Africa and exploit it for its resources. Now, the resources in Africa are numerous. There's gold and diamonds. That's sort of the big money things. There's also oil. There's also all sorts of minerals that are available in Africa. Now, by this time, we're not dealing with slavery. That's well gone. But the Belgians, especially, the Belgian Congo became synonymous or infamous because of the extreme brutality of the region under King Leopold II, who would use Belgian troops to sort of just indiscriminately kill and force labor. Now, we're not talking about slavery but we are talking about forced labor. And what's the difference? There's not much. Um, Other than, yeah, there's really not that much of a difference. The Europeans would not like to call it slavery, but it essentially was. And this will lead to lots of wars in the Congo. There's going to be the Boer Wars. There will be the English fighting wars throughout Africa, and just massive exploitation. And, it's the I can't stress enough how the European powers just simply didn't care about those people. And part of this is a thing called social Darwinism. And social Darwinism is, you hear the word Darwinism, that's Charles Darwin. And that's actual science. Social Darwinism is kind of what we call a pseudoscience, half science, that said that essentially certain people were naturally superior to other people. And because of that, conquest was okay, which the social Darwinists would say, well, since we're better, we're going to help those people be better. And of course, that was never the case, and it didn't really happen. This was a system that was created, and it was used to justify not only imperialism, but the suppression of workers. Say here in America, factory owners would say, oh, well, the Irish aren't as good as us other people, so therefore we can make them work for a little money as long as we're taking care of them. Very paternalistic. In Europe, imperialism is not just sort of only, European countries taking over places like in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and stuff like that. It's also present in Europe. And the decline of the Ottoman Empire was one of the examples of this. Russia, especially, would sort of start to undermine the Ottoman sovereignty. Now, if we want to think about the Ottoman Empire, we're thinking about Turkey, Serbia, Czechoslovakia, what would be Yugoslavia at a certain point, Croatia, those areas. And the Russians wanted those areas because there were resources there. There's an area called the Dardanelles, which is very important. It's off the coast of Turkey, and it's got a lot of oil. And they're going to want to control that area. But all these European countries start to undermine the Ottoman power. And because of this, the Ottoman Empire starts to crumble. And it's going to be the instability in the region is going to be one of the reasons why we lead to World War I. If you go back and we think about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire takes over lots of parts of that Ottoman Empire. So it's a very fragile existence. Now, when we say Persia, Persia is an old school term. Basically, we're talking about places like Iran, or Iran, but Iran. And this is, again, the Persians wanted their own sovereignty, meaning they wanted to rule themselves. But Britain and Russia were fighting for control over the region of Persia, what would be modern-day Iran. And the idea here is, once again, I know it keeps coming back to the same thing, but it's oil. There's oil there, and they want that resource. The Brits will win out in the short term. Following World War II, Iran will come under the influence of the Soviet Union, aka the Russians. And it's just a constant exploitation of the region. Now, the historical exploitation of that region has had long-term ramifications. It's why that region is not necessarily favorable to the West, not only Great Britain, who actually kind of controlled the region, but also the United States, which is associated with Great Britain, and are sort of meddling in oil affairs over there as well. Um, there was there was sort of resistance. For instance, when Italy tried to take Ethiopia at the Battle of Adwa, the Ethiopians were able to beat the Italians and maintain their independence. This kind of lends into the fact that the Italians weren't very good at fighting because the Ethiopians were not well equipped, and the Italians had tanks and machine guns, but they could not um, basically fight very well against the Ethiopians. Over in Japan, we have the Meiji Restoration. And the Meiji Restoration is a restoration of a imperial line. And when this imperial line is restored, Japan starts to modernize. And Japan had seen the writing on the wall. If they don't modernize, then these Western powers are going to try to colonize them or do to them what was going on in China. And Japan gets ahead of it. And they start to modernize really, really quickly. And very quickly, they become a power in the Pacific. And in 1904 and 1905, in the Russo-Japanese War, they shocked the world by beating the Russians. And all of a sudden, people are like, oh my gosh, the Japanese beat this giant European nation? Now, the Russians weren't necessarily modernized. They weren't as modernized as the Japanese. And one of the interesting things about the Russo-Japanese War is that it was fought in trenches with machine guns, and people should have looked at it and said, oh, this is what warfare looks like now. But they didn't. And that's why when you get to World War II or World War One, you still have people like lining up and trying to shoot at each other with these machine guns and massive casualties early on in the war before it devolved into trench warfare. So as we talk about the long-term consequences of imperialism, we still see it today. You look at the divide in Korea between North and South Korea, that the North Koreans were in the communist sphere of influence, the Russian sphere of influence, South Koreans in the Western sphere of influence. There are border conflicts. I mean, right now, the war with Ukraine, that is part of modern imperialism when the Soviet Union, after World War II, decided it was not going to leave the areas that it had liberated during World War II. So when I was growing up, Ukraine used to be called the Ukraine. And that was because it was part of the Soviet Union. Now it's called Ukraine because it's a free and independent nation. So there are still lots of struggles going on because of imperialism, especially this sort of, the vacuums of power that were created, the rise of dictators, especially across Africa. If you look across Africa and you see the amount of dictators that rose up in the post-World War I and post-World War II eras, that is because once these imperial powers leave, it creates what we would call a power vacuum, meaning that someone has to step up and lead. And typically it's going to be a strong man or a dictator that's going to do this. So I want you guys to think, as you're finishing up this lecture, how imperialism still exists today in an economic form. But how did it affect the world around us today? And I think if you look at it even through the lens of the United States, you can see the conflicts that we have. The Panama Canal has been in the news recently, and that is sort of part of an imperialist agenda. So The key terms are down here at the bottom. I suggest looking them up, reading about them in your chapter. As always, you can use online resources as well. All right. Well, there will be another lecture posted probably tomorrow or or on Wednesday. I hope you guys have a great week, and I will see you the week after spring break. Peace, guys.